O- Okay, great. Everybody is here. People are still joining us. So welcome everybody. Welcome to Joel. It is honor us in his presence to talk about the situation in Australia and the political situation. He's also CEO of a very interesting organization dealing with climate in Australia. I think it will be very interesting to hear. So this is a good opportunity that we are happy to have to learn a bit about what's going on in Australia and what we can learn, especially from the elections that are coming on here in Israel. So we have also so we have Joel from Australia and Yuval from EcoPeace that will manage the conversation here. And if people have questions and things want to rise up, so write in the chat and I will manage it, and hopefully that we can also do, if we also not that many people right now, so also have a conversation with all people who want to join. Yeah, so Yuval, you want to take the lead from here?
Yeah, sure. Great. So I'm Yuval from EcoPeace. For anyone who doesn't know, EcoPeace is an Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian organization. We've been around for 30 years almost. We work on regional cooperation on environment and increasingly on climate. Sort of traditionally, the focus has been more on water issues, but in the past few years, we've really seen the climate crisis presenting an opportunity for shared action. You know, I'm very curious, you know, as we head now into yet another round of elections here in Israel, to learn from the Australian example. What was it, about 2 months ago? Pretty dramatic elections in Australia after about 9 years of the same government, liberal conservative government, a Labor upset. And also the sort of role of civil society and Jewish civil society in influencing that outcome. So welcome, Joel. I guess to start off, I mean, can you tell us a bit about your group, your network, the Jewish Climate Network, sort of how it was founded, what your mission is, how you work?
Yeah, sounds good. Well, great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, first of all. Before I kick off, I just want to acknowledge that most of the people in this room, you'll have had far more experience than I will have had in the climate movement, whether in Israel or in other countries. I've only kind of started really to use myself, my physical self, my mental self on climate in the last 3-4 years. I was a corporate lawyer right at the beginning, and then I started working on healthy masculinity and a few different things. And then, yeah, I had my head in the sand, climate crisis I hadn't really heard of. And you know, then I learned about it, and I just decided to drop everything and work on this, you know, every second that I had. So you'll have as much to teach me as I have to teach you, but I can tell you a little bit about what's happening in Australia. That's really what I know. So the Jewish Climate Network was founded pretty much only 3 years ago, like just before I started as CEO. We used to have a smaller environmental group in Australia that was linked to Judaism and climate for about 15 years, and it had a little bit of traction. And only in the last 3 years did some of our big Jewish community leaders, like principals of our schools, parents, the heads of the Jewish Museum, the head of our security group, business and tech entrepreneur, they all kind of came together and realized that no one was really representing the Jewish voice on climate in Australia in a really strategic way. Maybe a bit of environmentalism and maybe a bit of sustainability, but not sort of hardcore climate emissions reduction strategy, policy, that kind of thing. And also that the Australian Jewish community for many years has been very effective at driving social change in Australia, Indigenous rights, human rights, social change, all kinds of other issues. But we've just kind of, we had gone missing on climate. Like there hasn't been an awakening, so to speak, among our leadership, business leaders, philanthropic leaders, any of them. So this group, this board came together about 3 years ago, decided to create the Jewish Climate Network and start to run conversations in people's homes. That was the first thing. let's just get one person, let's say Nir, he invites 10 of his friends, come over, I put on some schnitzel, we do a presentation on climate, and let's see what happens. And it was very personal, very intimate, and very safe. It wasn't like, who here doesn't know about climate and get them in trouble. So we started running that with hundreds of people, and there was a real kind of understanding that people didn't know enough. They then understood and they wanted to do something about it. So everything has kind of evolved since then. And then they brought Eleanor on, who was the first staff member. She started running those climate conversations, we call them. And then they brought CEO on, me, and we started to develop a broader strategy working with business and philanthropy and expanding our grassroots work a little bit more, and political engagement a little bit more as well. So, the more resourcing we can get, the more staff we can get, the more programs we can run. You all understand that story. So, and here we are, sort of, I'm 18 months into the role, and we're trying lots of new things. Some things are more successful than others, but we're getting a lot of traction. We're getting a lot of traction, I think, with the mainstream community. And I'd say one more thing before you ask that question is very important to us in our theory of change is that we don't just work with the usual suspects. We might say, I don't know what that is in Hebrew, but the usual people who've always been working on climate forever. They're very important and they've driven Australia to a certain point, but we have this other mass of people. They're not necessarily climate deniers. We don't have time to work with those people. That will take forever. But you've got this kind of big chunk of people in Australia, 60 to 70%, I'd say, on an estimate. They're not against, but they're not necessarily for. They're just I'm busy, But if you give them something to learn and you give them the actions that are required to solve the crisis, they want to take action. So we really want to work with the mainstream middle and, probably the more conservative parts of the community, because we know, with social change, if we can shift the more conservative, then everybody else moves over as well, right? It's like a big mass. And so if we can kind of bridge that gap and move everyone over, then the rest will sort of take care of itself. So that's kind of where we're coming from. So we work with rabbis, the Orthodox community, more conservative. We don't necessarily focus a whole lot on the more progressive parts of the community. There are many other Australian groups who already work with those segments of the community.
So, all right, I've got a lot of follow-up questions about what you just said. I guess maybe just to set the scene for us, I think a lot of us are familiar with the sort of the American Jewish community and what that looks like politically. You mentioned that the Australian Jewish community has been very involved politically on things like Indigenous rights. Can you just give us a sort of brief overview of the Australian Jewish community politically? Is it sort of like the American Jewish community where Israel is the one overriding issue for a lot of people? What is the...
So I would say we're extremely Zionistic community. Huge numbers of our young people go to Israel on a Shnat program, after school, Shnat Achshara, with their kind of youth movement. So very, very Israel-focused, pro-Israel sort of vibes. We spend a lot, I would say, of our community energy on combating anti-Semitism and extremism. Israel identity issues, things like that. So it's hard to say, we have 3 Jews, 10 opinions, we have all of the groups. We've got all the progressive Jews, we've got Orthodox Jews, secular, traditional, atheists, I don't care, whatever. So there's kind of everything. Most of our community are Holocaust surviving communities. So we have the biggest concentration of Holocaust surviving 3rd generation outside of Israel, even more than concentration in America. So all of my friends in class, for example, had a grandparent or more who went through the Holocaust. But you have these really strong progressive pockets as well. Like I said, so the most famous Indigenous land rights case ever in Australia called Mabo, maybe some of you know about it, which for the first time recognized that Indigenous people have a right to their lands, even though the British took it hundreds of years ago, was led by a Jewish barrister, Ron Caston. He's a very famous lawyer here. And you have individuals like this who are very famous and they're very inspiring. You've got everything. But if we could, very simplistically say, one brush stroke, relatively conservative community, but very strong progressive pockets as well.
Interesting. Yeah, and this whole idea of sort of doing climate conversations and broaching the topic in a way that's intimate and personal and safe. Can you give us a sense of what that looks like? How do those conversations, how are they structured? What are they?
well, I guess anyone here who's kind of done facilitation or, you know, less formal presentation style, it always starts with like, it's usually in a circle. You always start with introductions, why you're here, like all that kind of just normal personal stuff. And we essentially take people through two scenarios, the current, future, and the possible future for climate. And it's based on who I forget her name, who led the Paris Agreement. What was her name? It's very famous. I'm just blanking. It's 8 p.m. here.
Christiana Figueres.
Yeah, Christiana Figueres' book, The Future We Choose. So she kind of like has a section on, if we do nothing, this is our future. If we do something, this could be our future. And so we kind of evolve that, and we have images and we kind of show them and we tell it, we narrate the story. So it's very story-based as well. And we bring in a lot of Jewish aspects as well, because we understand that you just have to work with people's identities. If you just hit them with climate information, it's very overwhelming, and it's like, and it can border into like denial because they can't handle the information. It's very natural response. So we say, you know, not just what would it look like if Australia was 54 degrees for 30 days a year, but what does it mean for the Jewish youth camps if it's 54 degrees? What does it mean for your grandparent who lives in this aged care facility down the road? So we just bring it down to earth, local. We bring it to here, we bring it to now, as opposed to far away polar bears in the future. People are like, wow, I didn't realize that this is actually about my kid going and enjoying a Jewish life in Melbourne. I thought it was just about some hot place in Africa. And it's surprising. I mean, like, we've known a bit about this for decades. Like, how did you not make that connection? But I don't know, people are busy. So we make it really, really relevant to Jewish experience, I would say. Yeah, and I would say also there's like a bit of a like, we take them into the hole. Like, it's challenging. You go deep, you go dark a bit because you have to, that's the truth. But, you know, you don't want to end in that place. So we try and bring it up into hope at the end, and active and solutions and all that kind of stuff.
It's interesting that you said, you know, it's not just about some hot place in Africa, because I guess we're also from a very hot place that's heating very fast, but we sort of think of Australia as a place that is already experiencing the effects of climate change quite intensely.
Yeah,
so,
well, that's fun. That's interesting. You say experiencing over here, it's like over there, but for the average Jewish person who lives in a city like Melbourne or Sydney or Perth, who has an air-conditioned home, who can get into the shade, like, you don't necessarily experience it unless, like in the 2018-19 bushfires, you know, the forests around you are suddenly ablaze and 3 billion animals die. And it's like, okay, maybe it's closer than I thought it was.
Yeah, so what, I mean, that's part of my question is, right, is that, I mean, have there been moments when you think the Australian public has sort of woken up to the climate crisis, things like the wildfires a few years ago? And what does the conversation about climate in general look like in Australia?
So the bushfires was a massive turning point. These bushfires were the biggest, the hottest, the largest, the longest lasting that we've ever seen by a million miles. I mean, the full scale that the firefighters used from 0 to whatever it is, 10, there was nothing. There was no scale that ever existed to measure this. So this was, and for the first time ever, this was just before COVID, maybe 3 months before COVID first hit. And for the first time, smoke was filling the cities, right? In the past, bushfires in Australia, they stay in the forest or in a place where there's trees. You know, we had weeks and weeks where the cities were just blanketed. You couldn't see ahead of yourself. And people bought masks 3 months before COVID, when we started buying masks for another reason. I already had 10 masks at home just before COVID hit, because I bought them for the bushfires, not for COVID. And then I used them for COVID as well. So that was a massive turning point, and everything started to shift in the zeitgeist, in the public consciousness. And then COVID hit, everybody forgot about it. It was just not enough brainwaves to deal with two crises at once. So it's almost like it went underground for 2.5 years while we dealt with COVID. And as vaccinations came out, everything stabilized. They stabilized about 6 months before the federal election. And it was almost just like, wait a second, remember that climate crisis that was 2 years ago, and there's an election, and it was all just really interesting timing. It was a perfect storm of both having more brain space and COVID and election and all at the same time. So a lot of people suppressed it, and then it came back out just before the election. And a lot of research was done in lead up to the election, doing surveys with Australians on basic questions. How do you feel about climate? Are human beings causing it? Do you want your government to do more about it? And a lot of these statistics started coming out before the election from different institutes of different political persuasions. All of them said something similar, which was 70% plus of Australians, yes, 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 on all of these things about climate. We want more, they're not doing enough, blah, 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 blah. And interestingly, these statistics, they were not in the usual places, like the urban centres, like the Tel Avivs of, Australia, or as our Prime Minister said, in the wine bars of Sydney. They were in really kind of blue collar, shall we say, working towns, often coal towns that made their money from fossil fuels, were still overwhelmingly saying, we understand that our industry is fading, we want a transition, or whatever it is. They wouldn't use transition, that was a politically challenging word, but even those conservative places were saying we want more to be done. So, it was a perfect storm, and it's still happening.
Okay, so in this last election, I mean, maybe we'll start just sort of set us the scene for the political system in Australia. How do elections work? Do we all understand? What are the big parties? And then we'll sort of disentangle that a bit.
So I think my understanding is it's very different to Israel, right? You have 400 parties and a coalition of like 600 people, and you have to try and get everybody to agree on one thing, which is impossible. So we have like 3 parties: Liberal, which is Republican; Labor, which is Democrats; and the Greens, which is the Greens. And then you've got a few little parties, maybe 3 or 4, who are mostly right-wing parties, like One Nation, anti-immigration, Shooters and Fishers, they're into fishing and shooting. I don't know what their thing is. And a couple of other like little small ones, but they don't usually have much power. It's usually Labor or Liberal, and the Greens are never in the coalition. They're just like 1 seat in the lower house. So, so that's the situation. 3 main parties: Labor, Liberal, Green, a few little ones. We have a lower house and an upper house. You don't have that, do you? 2 levels. So we have lower house, legislation comes into the lower house for the first attempt. You pass the law there, it goes up to the upper house, where the representatives are a little bit different. And if you tick it off in the second house, then it's law. So all of the representatives in the lower house are based on a map of Australia, broken up into hundreds of little pieces. And each little piece is represented by 1 person. So when you come to the election, you vote for that 1 person in your area. My area is McNamara, covers about 40,000 people. And if this person wins in my area, we send him to Canberra, he represents us or she represents us. And the upper house is represented by states, because there's so many people in Melbourne and Sydney. If we just did it like that, Melbourne and Sydney would run the country, and that's not fair. So we have an upper house, a check and balance, and they represent the states, so they balance out the power. So that's how it works. What else did you ask? So we vote, we go to the elections every 3 years.
And this last election, do you think that the climate, first of all, the climate issue, do you think it sort of influenced all the parties going in the campaign? Were all the parties talking about, I assume the Green Party was talking about the environment and climate, but were the Liberals, were the Conservatives also sort of changing their tunes and forced to talk about this issue?
Okay, so there's like so many ways you can answer this. The independent movement, so this is a whole new thing this election. We've always had few independents. This election, there was like, used to be 3 or 4 independents. This election, there was maybe 15 or 20, and they all had very similar characteristics. It was a very interesting strategy. They were all women. They were all professional. So they came from banking or fashion or retail or law or something like that. Very well spoken, very educated, usually quite wealthy. And not always, but usually. And they all stood on the same pillars, so that they weren't a party. They were independents representing each of those areas I mentioned. But they all had the same 3 pillars: women, integrity, and climate. Women's rights, integrity, and climate. And this was identified as being one of the main weaknesses of the current government in those particular areas. So specifically in Melbourne and Sydney, urban centres, lots of disenfranchisement, frustration, anger by people about how the Liberal government, the Republican equivalent, had treated women. There were lots of scandals over the last year about political staff members raping or assaulting or abusing female staff members. So women was a big issue. integrity, which is really around truth and transparency, donation laws, things like that. There was a feeling there was a lot of secrecy, and that the independence would restore integrity and truth, and obviously climate as well. So it's hard to say exactly which of those three pillars most people voted on. I'd say most of the analysis afterwards called it the climate election. They didn't call it the women election or the integrity election, but it helped. It helped that you had these other issues and it wasn't just climate, climate, climate. So the independents, every day, women, integrity, climate, women, integrity, climate, women, integrity, climate, that was their thing. Occasionally you had some other policies, but that was the thing. The Greens obviously were also climate all day, every day. They were slightly more ambitious than the independents. The independents came with emissions targets between, say, 45 and 60. 60 was the highest, probably 50% reduction was the biggest since 2005. And Greens were advocating 75% by 2030. Oh, this is, yeah, by 2030. So they were always a bit more. So it helped the independents that the Greens were there, because it made the independents look more moderate, even though their position was twice as more ambitious than the Liberals, whose target was 26 to 28% emissions reductions by 2030. But Labor and Liberal, every kind of public appearance, the news, et cetera, they mostly stayed away from climate. Labor didn't really talk about it like climate that much. They spoke about it in very technical terms: jobs, opportunity, renewables, energy security. So they didn't really use climate that much. Occasionally their climate change minister would say, this is good for climate. Did they use the phrases like climate emergency, crisis? I don't think so. Yeah, I think his phrase was always, the world's climate crisis is Australia's job opportunity. That was his thing. Like he would sort of talk like that. So it was very jobsy. And they promised that everybody's electricity bills would fall by $275 in the first 3 years of the Labor government. So that was their big promise. Whereas the Liberals were saying, your prices will go up, your prices will go up, your prices will go up if you invest in renewables. So, and they had modeling. So last election, the Labor government got smashed, and they got smashed because they said, we're going to go for a 45% emissions reduction. And then the Liberals said, how much is it going to cost? And they didn't have an answer. And that was it. The end of the election, they lost, among other things. So this year they didn't make the same mistake. They got like Deloitte or EY, one of the big consultancies, modeling, hundreds of pages, the most extensive modeling an opposition party has ever done. And I think it was quite persuasive. You don't expect that because the opposition doesn't have any money. They have no staff. Usually they don't have any modeling. The government can invest, millions in that stuff and waste it. But they recognized that we needed this, and that Australians were very afraid of the increase in cost of living from the transition. So they answered that question quite well. And the Liberals just avoided it in their campaign. They just didn't mention it at all, hoping it would kind of go away. And they focused on things like China, security, China and security, really.
Is part of this because of the big interest in Australia? I mean, if we think about the sort of the powers that be in Australia, right? Probably one of the most famous Australians is Rupert Murdoch, right? The media magnate, right? Big mining interests. So you sort of in Israel we have this term hon shilton iton, right? Sort of interest of money, governance, and newspaper, right? So the sort of I mean, how did these big interests, how did they influence the parties? How did they influence the discourse around these issues, climate, environment? What role does the press or free press or sort of
Actually, I'll answer that, but I actually just want to go back. I forgot to mention something about different parties, a very important point, and that is the Liberal Party in Australia is not a monolithic entity. It's not a single ideology. It's actually made up of a lot of sub-factions, and they're very, very different, right? They're pretty much like a Jewish family at a Pesach Seder, like it's, you get the whole smorgasbord there. So a very important faction in the Liberal Party, they call themselves the moderates, the moderate Liberals. And there was about maybe 7 or 8 of them. Very important, very influential. The Treasurer of Australia was considered a moderate Liberal. He was Jewish, Josh Frydenberg, and a few in Melbourne and Sydney. And they were the most ambitious on climate throughout the election. And they found it very hard because on the one hand, they had members of their party pulling them to the right, and they had to compete with the independents and the Greens to establish their position as well. That they were very important they played a very important role in keeping the Liberal Party relevant to the climate conversation. And they were doing good things behind the scenes. And they found it very frustrating often when the climate movement slammed them and said, why are you doing more? And they're like, you have no idea how hard it is to try and get the government to commit to net zero 2050 when half of my colleagues deny that the climate crisis even exists. So they did very important work bringing the Liberal Party over to the centre and in touch with reality. Unfortunately, a lot of them got voted out because the independent strategy was to compete just with those, pretty much to compete just with them. So independent knocked out Liberal, independent knocked out Liberal, independent knocked out Liberal at the election. And so in one election, we lost like 6 moderate Liberals in the Liberal Party. So now the Liberal Party looks very different than what it did 3 months ago. It's now a lot more right, a lot more conservative. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 3 years, because now the Labor Party trying to work with the Liberal Party is going to be a lot harder. So it's a question for the climate movement in terms of strategy of like, you know, we lose things when we put moderate conservatives offside and can make it a bit harder to work on long-term climate solutions in the future. So it's just worth noting that. And I don't know what that's like in Israel. Like, who are the moderates, conservative, you know, climate champions? How do we support them and help them to amplify their voice so that the chasm and the gap is not too wide? And I don't know if that's going to come up in the election, but that was important to us. So Murdoch Media, good question. About a year before the election, the Murdoch Media came up with a big announcement. And the big announcement was, we are now going to report positively on climate. It was like, whoa. Everyone's like sharing, whoa, how did this happen? 30 years, Murdoch has been anti-climate. And suddenly, you know, everyone, what's behind it? What's the tactic? Why are they doing this? And it seemed good. Like, they're releasing videos with experts on renewable energy and land sequestration, And we thought, okay, maybe they just realized we'll lose advertisers, we'll lose customers. They're just kind of a marketing sensible decision. But then as the election got closer, their usual journalists started to publish really, it got very personal, let's just say that, in the lead up to the election. So their tactics seemed to be to find the backstories of all the independents, you know, scroll through Facebook 25 years and to find, you know, this candidate said this one thing and then write a whole article on it, share it with all of Australia. So that was quite a common tactic. And I was talking to someone, and I didn't work in any of the independent campaigns. I just heard this from people who did. That at the beginning, it was helpful because no one had heard of a lot of these independents. And suddenly the Murdoch Media is writing about them every day. So it was like free advertising, you know, any news is good news. But then it gets to a certain point where it just gets nasty, you know, and they start digging up things. And it actually got a little bit anti-Semitic at times. It was a bit weird. They would look into the staff members of the independents and find out that this one once, you know, said something about Israel. Actually, they're pro-BDS and all this kind of stuff. And the idea, it was actually quite pernicious because what they were trying to do is they were trying to appeal to Jewish voters in certain electorates, almost like dangling a rag in front of a bull. Like, you're going to vote for this person? Their staff member said something bad about Israel 10 years ago. And it was anti-Semitic because it reduced Jews to like one thing. You know, it was very reductionist. It was like, all you care about is Israel. And look at this, I'm showing you something negative. So you have to vote against this person, and not being like, a Jew has like 50 identities and cares about many things. So it got very strange, and they did that a few different times. And then, yeah, like, I mean, eventually, you know, the election came. There was only so many articles you could write. And to a degree, it's possible that it undermines the coalition or the Liberal Party's campaign, because they were seeing the articles and they were assuming that people are agreeing with the articles and they don't have to do any work to improve their climate position. And some people say this is what happened with Trump, right? He came out of nowhere. Millions of people maybe agreed with him, but they felt, you know, afraid to talk about it, or so you didn't really know beneath the surface what was happening. So I think with the reporting before this election, you couldn't really tell, like, how many people are really pro-climate in Australia, because the news suggests that there's no one. But you go under the surface and the surveys are saying that there's many. So boom, suddenly, you know, all that matters is the vote on the day.
So we've got some good questions in the chat, and I'll actually start with the second one with Vered. She's interested about how you're involved with lobbying with government decision makers, and I'll sort of add to that, right? I mean, if you can talk about how you influenced in this election, right? I mean, how you worked to influence the election as the Jewish Climate Network, and then how you continue to work with the new government.
Yeah. Look, it's
and how you see the trend of the government towards changing policy towards fossil fuels.
Yeah. If I forget that second question, remind me, I'll answer that as well. I think I could be tempted into overstating our influence, you know, like everybody likes to think that, oh, it was because of us, that the whole thing. We worked within our communities, you know. We're not a massive, you know, 50,000 people here, 50,000 in Sydney, that's all, you know. So we have maybe 4 or 5 key electorates, all the little bits of Australia. And so we supported them to engage with their politicians with common kind of tactics that many of you will have used. You know, we set up a platform, a website, we pre-wrote emails and texts for people that they could change and whatever, and did most of the work. And a great platform actually where you put your details in, your phone number, you click the button, make the call, and it automatically connects through to the politician that is in your area. So you don't have to find their phone number. So just tried to make it really, really easy for the community to engage, write letters and make phone calls. So, and to be honest, that was kind of the first time that I know of that the Australian Jewish community had gotten kind of politically engaged in climate in Australia. There was no kind of way to do that before JCN was around. And what was the impact of that? It's, you know, it's hard to say, but I was talking to a staff member of a politician around like, what really is the benefit of writing a letter to a politician? Like, just tell me from the perspective of the politician, right? You work in the office every day, 3 months before the election. How do you feel when an email comes in, a letter comes in, a phone call comes in? He kept saying, to be honest, not many people write to politicians. They don't have time, they can't be bothered. So one letter has a far bigger impact, 5, 10, it feels like, whoa, there's a wave of letters. Really, it's only 10 letters, you know? So if you get 200 people from the community writing in, it can leave a really lasting impression on that politician. And 200 is a lot, you know, in a way for a particular electorate when no one's writing. So, you know, that's the kind of work we were doing. And otherwise, it's just engaging through our connections or personal relationships with politicians whenever we have to support them. And I like using the word support as opposed to lobby. I mean, yes, I mean, I guess that's one way to look at it, to lobby them. But really the way I see it is there are many politicians, especially like the moderate liberals, who wanted to do more, but don't necessarily have the resourcing or to write policy, to think about it in depth. It's kind of to help them figure out a really good policy that's going to win. We talk about here, I don't know if you use a phrase like this in Israel, but a race to the top. We often talk about a race to the bottom. So we're trying to build a race to the top here. Give these guys a good policy, they'll compete, they'll try and get a better policy, and boom, 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 and hopefully you set something off like a chain reaction. But ultimately we're a small organization, we're three staff and a relatively small board. So I think over time, we'll hopefully engage even more and give more tools for the community and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting that you said, and it's a difference, with the Israeli system, is that you have the districts, right? So places where there are big pockets of, a big Jewish community, and the Jewish community has a lot of influence over the local representative, right?
Yeah.
That's right. We don't have that. I mean, we have primaries in some parties. We have a lot of parties without primaries, and I mean, very little sort of local, like the Likud, for example, has some local representatives in its list, right? But for the most part, we don't really do local representation at the national level.
Yeah, that is very interesting. So who do the politicians most feel answerable to before an election, apart from donors?
I mean, that's a good question. I'm curious what other people here in the conversation think, because I think that really gets to the heart of it. I mean, that local accountability that you have in Australia is really key, I think, to your ability.
All a politician in Australia needs to care about 2 months before an election is the 40,000 people who live within 10 kilometers of their seat. They don't have to care about anything. Prime ministers, nothing, just that. Even the treasurer, spends 3 years focusing on big international whatever. 3 months before, he becomes extremely local. He's eating bagels with Yossi in the cafe next because he needs Yossi's vote. Like it's very interesting how you become so big, and then just for an election you become hyper local. That's just the nature of it.
Yeah, I mean, we have, so to some degree, right? I mean, I think there are certain parties in Israel where you have sort of pretty captive voters, right? Like people who vote for Meretz, right? Famously, there's like they'll sort of, they'll complain about Meretz, for years, and then they'll vote for Meretz. So there, it's whether you convince them to go vote, or whether they'll stay at home, but they'll probably.
Oh, right. You don't have voting, compulsory voting. Yeah.
Or so you have compulsory voting. So that's another
compulsory voting. Yeah, it's a lot easier.
Okay.
You have to vote. Depends. This question is who.
So I think in Israel, a big, also now with the Arab Israeli population, right? They have an outsized influence on the outcome of this election, because if they go and vote in large numbers, then then that might be 15 mandates, right? I mean, it's the upper limit there is actually pretty high, and that could be what stands between a Likud government or not. So the whole question of turnout is really critical here. But I'm curious, other people in the audience. I mean, the question of accountability is interesting. If anyone has any opinions, because.
And then I'll answer Vered's second question about fossil fuel policy too.
Yeah, I don't know, Nir, if you have an opinion on it, right? Like, who I mean, especially these people like Kachol Lavan, there's parties where they really, I mean, they're only accountable to the party leader.
I think what Joel tell it's something very interesting, because we don't think here in Israel about the local responsibility. I think most of the politicians are looking nationally, also because of how the system is working. It's a very interesting point of view.
Yeah,
I didn't thought about it before.
I think they're accountable according to sectors. Like there is the Haredi parties, they will be accountable for their audience, and there will be those who are representing settlers, and those who are representing. So they are answering to the sectors that they're representing, and they are not geographical.
So you would never have like a Haredi MK trying to get the vote of a Tel Aviv secular person. They wouldn't waste their time on it.
Right.
It's never going to happen. So here you can get anyone's vote. Like if you give them a good enough argument, anyone could be your voter.
Yeah.
So it seems like each of your MKs has a limited pool, and the only way the pool gets bigger is if they have children.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're the parties with the primaries, and there are parties without primaries, and then you're really just accountable to the figure at the top, right? I mean, Yair Lapid, he picks his list, and Benny Gantz and so on, and there it's just, are you a loyal soldier?
But you have to get voted in by the people.
You have to get voted in. Your party, right? I mean, your party needs to get voted in, but you're placed on the list as a candidate or as an individual politician. Really, your political fate mostly hangs on the one person or the party bigwigs. So.
Can I just quickly add another difference? Joel, am I right that in Australia someone would get a fine if they don't vote?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that's not the case in Israel. In Israel, we have a very massive percentage of non-voters, and those non-voters could have completely shifted the political map in Israel. So what happens is that a lot of the politicians, like generally there's a really massive desperation from Israeli politics. A lot of people don't vote because they don't believe the system anymore. So what happens is that you have a lot of parties really fighting for those desperate voices, especially left-wing parties like Havoda and Meretz, which are perceived to be the greener party. And what happens is they would really just scratch the surface looking for the people that don't want to vote, and they would get them to vote because they would be typically voting for them. And we're losing, I would say we're losing about 4 or 5 mandates every single year just because of non-voters. And that could have, because we're on 59 to 61 at the moment, we are, the coalition would, you know, it could fall because of non-voters. So I think that's a really good thing going for you guys, is that you would find someone that wouldn't vote. And if that would have happened in Israel, if that was the Israeli system, we would likely to have a more moderate coalition.
Yeah, am I correct in saying that in America, I think around the Obama election, their main strategy wasn't necessarily, it was just around enrolling voters to vote.
Get out the vote,
To vote, like, which is, task was new. It's like you're spending all this effort just to get the vote as opposed to who you vote for. So that's very interesting. It must be similar for you as well. But Israel is the highest voting country of non-compulsory voting in the world, right? I mean, that's what it used to be.
Really?
It was like 70%, I think.
I haven't heard that data, but
I'm not sure it's the higher. I'm not sure it's the higher, but it's quite high compared to.
It's quite, it's quite high, but it's, you know, at this point, by the fifth election, I think people get a bit disaffected. I mean, the other difference that we have here, and I mean, it's vis-a-vis the Greens, it might be an interesting comparison, is, you know, we have the threshold, right? So there's a lot of very strategic voting here. I mean, the new parties form, but, you know, they need 4 mandates to even get into the Knesset. So you have a lot of concern, especially from the sort of mothership parties, the Likud, you sort of are, you know, from Yesh Atid, about new parties that form in their camp that might waste votes that could otherwise go to a big party. And
I don't know if this is like, if you want to discuss this now or not. I'm just kind of, I have a question. I'm really interested in how your approach as a movement or as individual organizations. Do you spend more effort or energy getting people before an election to vote for parties that historically have good climate positions? Or is it about engaging with the other parties and having them strengthen their positions so that even if many people vote for right-wing or conservative parties, those parties are now better on climate? So it almost doesn't even matter anymore because everybody's better on climate. You're focusing on voters.
That's a wonderful point that you just made. I think it's awesome that you said that, because I think Israel is where the first example you are. We try to vote for the Green parties. I don't think it even occurred to anyone in Israel to try to greenify parties that have no interest in that, or would even see climate change as a left-wing lunacy, which is a lot of
we've done here. It's exactly what we were doing.
Exactly, not exactly, and maybe somebody from לבחור ירוק here that's want to answer this question. Somebody that is.
Victor is here. Maybe if he hears us, he can say something.
Victor, you want to say something? He's listening.
I'm just like, my question is, did any one of the other parties, other than Meretz and Avodah, have in their matzah, or maybe Yesh Atid as well, have in their matzah any relations to climate change at all?
I can.
And is it thanks to civil organizations?
Before you answer, Vera, I would kind of even ask another question on that one, or just add to it, is it doesn't even need to be expressed as a climate platform. It could be expressed as a renewables technology platform, but we all know it's all the same outcome, you know? So in a different language, but same place. I wonder.
Fair enough.
Actually, Nir, you can answer it, right?
I want to give you the stage. I want to give you the stage.
Okay. Yeah, we've done it last time that we had an election, which was just over a year ago. Our organization is called לבחור ירוק, Vote Green, and the idea was to persuade as many parties as possible to include green, climate, environmental, sustainable policies in their matzah. How do you say it in English?
Their platform.
Platform. And we quite succeeded in it, but what we found out later is it's very nice that it was written in the platform, but majority of things did not really actually happen.
Right, it was marketing.
So we are now considering how we're going to try to do it differently and maybe get them to show actions even before the elections, and not just make promises, because they made beautiful promises, and we succeeded in quite a few right-wing parties also to put it into their platforms, ideas of yeah. So
that's very interesting.
But it's actually what we're trying to do in this group, Vote Green. Yeah.
How did you do that? Like, how did you appeal to them, and what made them even change their?
We had personal meetings with them. We were attending election, elections meetings and Chuge Bayit.
Right.
I'll just make clear it's a work of a coalition of organizations all over the environmental movement, and also private people that are joining this group.
Yes.
So just presenting our questions to candidates, and in every meeting we could attend for every party possible. And then we were lobbying, we were meeting with them personally, talking, seeing what topics they can relate to better, and then suggest to them ways of channels they can be working, and then pressuring them to put it into their platforms, and also working with the public. Actually, when you're attending election meetings, you have an opportunity to speak both to candidates and the public who is hearing. By presenting the question, you raise their awareness. We made them accountable. We tried to make them more accountable.
Yeah, nice.
They made promises. Yeah.
Well, Yom Kippur is coming up, so they can deal with those promises then.
So I guess, to get back to the second part of Vered's question, right? The sort of current changes in policy, and I guess sort of how you now post elections, right? How you keep the politicians accountable and sort of on message on these points.
Yeah. So I mean, in the lead up to the election, so recently, even as important as the election, 2 weeks ago, we passed like one of the most important climate pieces of legislation in our history, enshrining 43% emissions reduction and a few other things. The Greens Party were negotiating before the bill was passed to have them include a ban on all new coal and gas, all new fossil fuels, and they have not agreed to that. Partly because their donors come from those industries. The approach of the Labor Party now seems to be a few different things. One is letting the markets decide, and the markets, they say, will decide for cheaper electricity, which is renewables. They don't deal with speed. The market might deal with it in 20 years, 5 years, 8 years, I don't know, but the market will deal with that. But it's interesting. What I'm noticing is they're now introducing changes to regulation. So I know the climate movement often wanted them to make big statements, no new fossil fuels, this much emissions, and they wouldn't necessarily commit to all that stuff. But now we're seeing them do interesting little things, which I'm learning a lot from. So for example, we have a federal government agency called ARENA, Australian Renewable Energy something. Its job is to give grants, millions or billions of dollars, to new technology and renewables, clean energy technologies. And the battle over the scope of ARENA is an ongoing battle in Australia. Do you widen it to let it give money to developing nuclear as a clean energy, or to hydrogen or whatever? And so the Liberal government would always try and widen the scope of ARENA to let them lend money to clean gas and things like that. And so now the Labor government is working through ARENA to increase its investment in renewable energies, to narrow the scope, all that kind of stuff. So, it's not a sexy announcement, but if you look behind the regulations, it's going to make, things like that make a big difference. Or anytime a new coal mine is going to be, or a gas plant is approved in Australia, it has to go through environmental checks. We've always had that. Every country has that. The question is, what's on the list of things that you have to check? It's a long list, many pages. It's not necessarily sexy to change that list. But if you just add one sentence of like, what is the climate impact of this development? Suddenly everything changes. You haven't banned fossil fuels, but you have made it very, very hard to check that box on that fossil fuel. So I'm seeing them make, little changes here and there, which it's hard to say what's behind it. Are they doing this kind of on purpose, that they do agree with broader climate movement and they want to be ambitious, but they don't want to piss too many people off. So they're doing it this way. So it's early days, we're not sure. But what I'm hearing is that they are engaging very constructively with the independents who are very ambitious on climate. Before the bill goes out, they have meetings with all of them. They show them the draft, they get input and feedback. And they didn't need to do that. There's no obligation to consult with the independents, but they're doing it. They want to create a strong coalition of pro-climate. So it's early, we'll see, but I don't think we're going to see them ever ban fossil fuels outright. Will they increase their target? They're currently enshrined a 43% target reduction, 2030 versus 2005. I don't think they're going to increase that target. What they probably will do is they'll boost investment in renewables and they'll just watch us surpass that target. So, you know, hopefully it works and hopefully it actually ends up reducing by 60, 70%. And it wasn't a target, but it happened anyway. So, you know, they model that it will achieve something, but they don't promise that it will achieve something. It's the promising which is causing climate wars in Australia. We promise 26% or we promise 41%, you know, so that pisses a lot of people off. Yeah.
We've got a few questions here in the chat about climate education. Let's just mute this. Climate education in Australia. I don't know how involved you are with education, with schools, with maybe Jewish youth programs or Jewish summer camps. But we've got a few audience members who are sort of interested about the both the current state of climate education. So is it being taught? I mean, is it even being addressed in schools and in curricula? And then also how, I mean, what's your strategy with regards to that? And I guess I'd also add to that, I mean, sort of just generally sort of, you know, we at EcoPeace, we always talk about sort of bottom up and top down and sort of combining the bottom up and the top down work. And so in general, you as activists, how do you sort of combine the top down and the bottom up, the grassroots?
Yeah. In terms of the curricula, official curricula in schools, I don't know what the nature of the climate content is. Yeah, I'm not sure. My colleague Eleanor knows a lot more about that. She's a teacher and she's really dived into that. In terms of JCN and education, because we have limited capacity, we only have 2.5, 3 staff. We have to focus on the highest impact things. Education is obviously very important. It's very long term. It's a long game, isn't it? Like, you know, if we only have 3.5 years to peak emissions, we haven't yet had the resourcing to work with, say, year 10 students on climate action, because it's going to take a while for that influence to come to fruition, you know, in society. I wish that was a mainstream thing 20 years ago, and those people would now be the politicians, you know. So having said that, the climate strikes movement in Australia is extremely effective. And that unlocked a lot of people's minds, including my own mind, when I wasn't across climate that much and I saw the news covering thousands of young people in the streets. That was very effective. So they're very good at doing that. It's less our strategy. But occasionally, because we're also close knit, like I come from the youth movement world as well, if they ask us to like do a training or a talk, like we'll do it, because, you know, the youth of the Melbourne Jewish community are actually quite influential still, because they represent the future for our community. And the older generation of organizations want to appeal to the younger generation. And if the younger generation says, what are you doing on climate? And they say nothing, then they lose relevance. So we do a bit, but we don't do a huge amount. We, you know, support them to create climate policies, you know, to think about their SNUT program. How can you bring climate into your SNUT program? Things like that. Yeah. Oh, and also around the election, we went to each of the youth movements and we gave them that tool, the letter writing and the phone call tool. And we said, you know, write to them, email, call them. And they had a lot of energy and they wrote a lot of letters, which is great. So.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, Liel, Anat, is there anything specific you, I mean, it's interesting that 2 people asked about climate education.
I actually know a little bit about the Australian curriculum. I'm happy to just briefly say that if you're curious. They have a similar approach to the Israel curriculum, which is there isn't one, but a lot of schools still choose to actively, because there's a lot of private schools in Australia, and they actively choose to bring climate change and integrate that into the curriculum. Their disciplinary approach is quite similar to Israel, which is an interdisciplinary approach. They kind of like take climate changes, they put it under an existing discipline like geography, social sciences, and stuff like that, but it doesn't really work. There's actually a professor in Victoria University doing a global survey about that, and we'll know in November what the results are, but basically it's not looking very good. Australia is very competitive when it comes to high schools, especially private schools, which are, you know, the population that is more likely to care about climate change anyway. Super competitive. So year 11, year 12 would highly likely not even hear about that because they're too busy for the final exams.
Yeah, agree with that. Yeah, we need more Jewish doctors and lawyers. We don't have time. Yeah. I will say one other thing about education and JCN's approach. I'd say our main educational activity or initiative is actually more community-wide, and it particularly linked to Chagim. So we do 3 times a year. We'll do one linked to Yamim Noraim, Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that kind of thing. Pesach, the Seder, like we invited people to put an ice block on their Seder table and watch the ice block melt throughout the Seder. And the children are like, why is there an ice block on this? Yeah, and it's simple, physical. You see that it's almost like performance theater. And it was great. 5,000 people did it. And I would love to see that everywhere, like Israel, America, whatever. It's super simple. Put the ice block, one question. And suddenly the Seder they're talking about climate, you know. That's Pesach and Tu B'Shvat, of course, you know. So, and those things we do wide, you know, we'll set up a platform. We'll share resources with everybody. We'll encourage all the schools and Batei Knesset to be involved and yeah, that kind of thing. Right. But it's light, you know, it's not like super deep.
Do you see other groups in Australia, like, I don't know, indigenous groups, Muslims, other sort of identity-based communities adopting this similar approach around?
Yeah, I love this. This is maybe the best question of all. The best question, because we're kind of, we're part of an informal group of climate organizations. It's a little bit to the side of the general movement, and each of them has a very specific identity. So for us, it's Jews, but the other groups are, we've got surfers for climate, like surfing, like how Australian is that? It's hilarious. But they're very effective because, you know, they talk about mining on the coasts and how that destroys the waves and their ability to surf, and Aussies love surfing. So they really cut through in surfing cities. They're very effective. Farmers for climate action. Of all the professions in Australia, maybe globally, farmers are the most respected voice on climate. Scientists are second in Australia because it's so physical, the land, you see what's happening. Farmers for climate, parents for climate action, veterinarians for climate action. So pets like animals for climate. Missing some obvious ones. AFL players for climate, they're very effective, like football, like footy. And they're famous footy players. And they're out in the news, people love them, Instagram. So each one has their own thing. And this is a kind of a recognition that the broad approach to climate is sometimes not successful because it doesn't touch me in my identity place. So let's let the footy players talk to the footy lovers, the surfers talk to the surfers, you know, and obviously, you know, Jews talk to Jews. So that's the way it is.
Cool. I mean, I'll ask you maybe one final question, then we'll open it up to other questions. We've got about half an hour left. So, I mean, as we've talked about this, right? That we have our elections coming up in November. And are there any sort of words of wisdom, advice, as we think about how to strategize around that, how to approach it? Just general takeaways that you've had from your political cycle.
Yeah. I think, I don't know how useful this is, but I think I would just say, like, to think long term, you know, winning the election. We learned a very important lesson here after the last Labor government was in power. Everybody thought, when they come in power, they'll introduce a carbon tax, you know, emissions will go down, and it happened. But they didn't do enough work with the rest of the political spectrum. So every single day that the last Labor Party was in politics, every single day, the opposition destroyed them, attacked them on every single climate policy. And when the election came around, everybody knew which way it was going to go because they had 3 years of destroying their policies. There weren't enough people working behind the scenes with the people who weren't in power, so that when the important decisions came, the opposition could have fought about something else. Let them fight about some other policy. So I think I would just say, whatever the whatever the outcome, try and bring people together as opposed to splitting them apart. Try and find a bipartisan or multi-partisan approach so that even if you do win, even if all the best climate policies win, at least then in 3 years, you won't go back to square one and start all over again. You will have some traction, you know? So, you know, try to build bridges, don't, you know, all that kind of stuff, which you know all these things, I'm sure, but that was the lesson I think I saw here.
Very cool. Cool. So if anyone has, you know, wants to speak, questions, comments.
Can you tell a little bit about your strategy with religious publics? I think I've heard you speaking to a rabbinical council of some sort, or am I mixing it up? Can you just tell me, how did you approach it? So curious.
Yeah. I think it's similar to my point about the surfers and the farmers and the vets and the teachers and the parents. Like, we helped facilitate a climate training for the Rabbinic Council of Victoria. They're like the roof body for all of the Orthodox rabbis. But I didn't deliver the content. You know, we had a well-respected Rav who delivered the content. He happened to work in climate science at a university as well. So he knew the halakha, he knew the science, and he was a trusted messenger. For us, it always comes down to who is the most trusted messenger. If I'm not the most trusted, I'm not going to do the talking. I might help organize the event, but it's not me. And that makes sense, because who am I to talk about halakha? Like, I'm not, you know, I'm not a rabbi. So that's the first thing. Also, so, you know, first I found the speaker, and then I brought that speaker to the Rabbanim who I knew would respect him. And that's, I think that's how that works. But also I had good relationships with some of these Rabbanim, because also, I mean, I have an Orthodox background. I am still like, whatever, I don't know, how do we define our kind of identities, but I live a roughly halachic lifestyle, and I'm a halachic Jew. So I understand it wasn't like a trick or anything. It's like they are a part of me. I'm a part of them, their view of Judaism, their approach to life. So it wasn't a stretch for me to be like, oh, like, how do I trick this other group who are not like me into doing something on climate? You know, so I think, I don't know, I think the answer is finding trusted messengers and having an authentic connection with the people you want to run the climate session with.
More questions? Okay.
Do you have any other questions for us? Final questions for the Israelis?
I don't know. Well, I'm not ready with more questions.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to.
I'll be watching. I'll be watching closely. You know, my sister, she lives in Israel. She's got 3 kids. I hope you guys get good climate outcomes for them. Nah, I don't have any questions.
So since no one is asking, I just want to say I'm going to be in Melbourne in October.
Nice.
If you have any events or anything, it would be nice if I could join or.
Yeah. You've Nir and Yuval have my email,
Yeah.
so
There you can contact me later.
Right.
Give you
Okay.
Joe details.
I just wanted to say that it was very interesting for me, and I learned a lot of stuff about Australian politics, and thank you for joining us and explaining us everything. Yeah,
very interesting.
My
Thanks.
pleasure.
And I have another question that's jumping in my head now. With this situation now in Australia, can you say that you are optimistic to the future on, or are you still in a puzzle? What's it gonna be?
I think it changes every day. Like, I'm far more optimistic now than I was 3 months ago. I think a lot has changed. It just depends on the news article that I read when I wake up in the morning.
Don't read the news.
Yeah, like, you know, I'll read about Europe now and I'm like, oh, fuck. But then I'll read about, what a new wind farm, you know, so it's like, ooh, every day, which is, I'm sure you all feel that. So, but way more optimistic in Australia, that's for sure.
So do you think that the Australian government now is much more in the right direction than it was in the past, or it's
The
still...
government,
Because
the government,
I'm asking it because of, like, we had, like, that told about vote green. We had the feeling in the last election that now things were going to change. I still don't know if it's something that actually changed in the last year, but you had quite a small earthquake in Australia in the politics. So
yeah. I mean, we'll see. This whole new independent thing is new for us. Like I said, we usually have 3 parties, no independents, not that many. Now we have, 7 independents, 4 Greens. Oh, I mean, I didn't mention, I know you said we didn't talk much about the Greens, but the Greens had the biggest success by a mile this election. Usually 1 seat, now they got like 3 seats in the bottom house, and the top house, they're full of Green. They got a lot of power. So I think it's going to be a far better 3 years ahead. We'll see, like, there's pandemics and there's wars and people get distracted, and we got to stay on task. That's just if we just stay on task, then I think we've got a chance.
Well done. All הכבוד.
Yeah, as far as 3 people go, you guys are doing a heap.
Thank you. I never feel like we're doing enough. It's very annoying. But we do, yeah.
Well, that's everyone in this field would feel exactly the same.
Yeah, but thank you. Yeah, it's good to know. We're releasing some podcasts with around Elul this year, so maybe I'll share it with some of you. We'll have like famous Jewish Australians sharing their thoughts on Judaism and climate. And
yeah, I'll be glad if you send it to me.
Yeah.
I can send it to all the climate coalition here. I'm sure that people will be interested about it.
Also, the chair of our board, Eitan Lenko, he's a very kind of famous climate business entrepreneur here in Australia. He's coming to Israel for 4 or 5 weeks, in 1 or 2 weeks. So he was keen to meet folks. If you're kind of in that space of like tech, investment, renewables, policy, I'm sure all of you are in various parts, but
you can we will like to. Will be good.
Yeah,
we could help.
He'd like to see what's going on.
Connect. So you
Nice.
can contact us. Great.
Yeah.
Yuval, you want to wrap it up? So.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. I think, for me, and I'm sure for many people, the sort of, on that note of optimism, right? This past year was, it was a year of some sort of normalcy. I think for many of us, we were able to, at least I know at EcoPeace, we were able to really find a sort of receptive audience and a partner in government. And so we're a bit queasy about this election, but I think that the challenge is really to sort of heed your point that finding partners in the opposition, whatever the opposition might be. The climate issue is at EcoPeace we're all about sort of the climate issue is bigger than political borders, and I think it's bigger than political differences also within our country. It's you can't we're sort of past the point of denial, even though you do see sort of a bit more sort of US imported climate denialism in Israel, right? They're trying to turn into US style Republicans, but we're sort of past that point. So whoever's in government, whoever wins the election, whatever the constellation, we're gonna need to move forward on this, and I think that's really the challenge. So thank you for making that point, and I think we learned a lot, and hopefully this is also the start of sort of fruitful collaborations between the Climate Network here in Australia and
absolutely.
So
I'd love to hear from any of you, or send me links to your websites. I'd love to see what you each do and how you do it. It's awesome to see so much strength going on in the climate movement in Israel. It's good stuff, really good stuff.
Joel, do you mind putting on the chat your email, just in case anyone wants to be in chat?
Joel@jcn.org.au. Or
Great.
WhatsApp. Israelis use WhatsApp, no?
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joel.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you
My
very much,
pleasure.
Yuval,
To everyone. Good luck. May it be a good election.
Thank you for everybody who joined us.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
See ya.